Well, good morning, everybody. There we go. In case you're wondering, I'm Charlie. This is Kathy. What we're going to do is go through, review sort of the work, give a little background on the Center of Inquiry. The Center of Inquiry is a preposterous and very presumptuous title. We didn't make it up. And the work that we do with institutions in the U.S. So we'll talk about that a little bit, talk about the Wabash study. And the thing I want to say is, and try to leave some time for questions at the end. And what we're going to do is some of what we'll say may sound critical of the sort of assessment or learning gain work that we've done. It's not. We're really committed to the work. We've been doing it for 12 years now. But we're going to try and, when we pull together this talk, we try to think about, well, if we were starting from scratch again, what lessons would we look back on? How maybe would we have structured things differently that might be beneficial, therefore, to you? So, why don't you start?
Okay. Good morning. So I wanted to take a minute or two just to talk a little bit about who we are, what the Center of Inquiry is, and what we do. As the slide says, we work with people at colleges and universities, mostly in the U.S., to help them use evidence to strengthen liberal arts education. And when we talk about liberal arts education, we mean a broad education, so not discipline-specific, but the broad sort of education that gets at qualities like critical thinking, intellectual curiosity, leadership, political and social involvement. They're the sorts of things that, for U.S. institutions at least, you see in almost every mission statement. For example, Wabash College, which is the college that we are affiliated with, their mission statement is to educate students to think critically, act responsibly, lead effectively, and live humanely. Minor little things, easy to accomplish. But those are the sorts of qualities that we're talking about when we talk about liberal arts education. And we work with a range of institutions. So we work with private institutions, public institutions of any size, from small 300-student private colleges to the University of Michigan, which has tens of thousands of undergraduate and graduate students. Again, range of selectivity, range of everything in the world. And we use a collaborative approach. So we don't work at the policy level. We have a very grassroots, hands-on, face-to-face kind of approach. We travel a lot, almost every week. We visit many different kinds of institutions, and we work directly with faculty, with staff, with students at those institutions to help them gather and make sense of evidence on what their students are experiencing and learning, and figure ways to use that to improve their institutions. We are not affiliated with any government agencies in the U.S. We are not affiliated with the higher education accreditors. We are a small, not-for-profit organization, about seven folks on staff, and we work at Wabash College. So we got into this by doing a very large research study, which Ellie mentioned. It's called the Wabash National Study, and big research and an assessment project was what it really turned into. And this was a large study, involved 49 institutions, again, range of institutions, 17,000 students from all across the U.S. This was a longitudinal study, so we tested students at 3 points in their college career: when they walked in the door, at the end of their first year, and then at the end of 4 years, when hopefully they graduated. It was a mixed method study in the sense that we gave students a variety of surveys and outcome measures, but then as Charlie and I worked with the institutions to help them make sense of the reams of data they got back, we always spoke to students and faculty and staff at those colleges and universities, trying to see any sort of trends or themes we saw in the data, trying to flesh that out and understand it within the specific institutional context. Because as we saw in our work with institutions, a little trend in the data could mean different things at different institutions. So it was very important to have those conversations on the ground. And then our purpose in doing this study was not to benchmark institutions or create another ranking system. I don't know about here, but in the US there are thousands of ranking systems. It seems like new ones come out every day, throws everyone kind of in a tizzy. But our purpose was to get good quality data and then help people understand and use that data to improve the work they were doing with their students.
So let me give you the idea of the change theory behind it. And part of what we'll talk about today is that our work evolved over the last decade or so as we did this. The original idea, and what I heard a little bit this morning, was really creating high-quality evidence for institutions to use for improvement. Over time, that evolved to getting high-quality evidence and then supporting the actual making sense and use of the evidence, which turns out to be even more important than gathering the evidence itself. But the theory of change we had behind it is we got high-quality evidence to institutions. That evidence could then be used for change and improvement. So what do we mean by high-quality evidence? Well, we engage ourselves and a group of very good researchers in this project. But what we try to do is create longitudinal student-level data. So longitudinal data on each student in the study. I think there were over 800 pieces of information on each student that we had in the study from those 3 points in time that Kathy talked about. We had a variety of measures of learning or outcomes, some of which I'll talk about more specifically in a second, but we had direct and indirect survey instruments and measures of critical thinking and moral reasoning. We also had student grades. We also had the number of credits and courses that students completed and their time to graduation. And in fact, we designed this from the start so that every piece of information we collected could be merged with information institutions had in their student information systems. And that was done for free for schools that wanted to do that. Okay, so they could really line it up with any information they had about their students' behaviors on campus. We also had measures of in and out of classroom experiences. You heard about NESE. We had the National Survey of Student Engagement, which asked students about what kind of classroom practices they're experiencing, how much work they're doing, and so on, whether they're engaged in deeper learning. And the point of grabbing this is really interesting to hear about the proxy this morning. The point of that information and the whole model we used was we had a variety of outcome measures. We would look at how students changed over time in those outcome measures. We also had a variety of measures of what students reported experiencing in the classroom on pedagogies, on the kind of work they were doing, and so on. And what we tried to do for each institution, they would say, here's how much your students have learned, how they've changed over time, and then here are the classroom practices, the work habits, and so on, that are predicting that change. In essence, to give a diagnosis at the student level of what kind of pedagogies, classroom experiences, and so on, were accounting for differences in student growth. We did that nationally, and we did that for each institution. So the idea was to not just give you learning gains, but a diagnosis of what things might be changed on campus to help the students who weren't learning as well. So here are the outcome measures. I haven't used the official names for them. We had a critical thinking measure, which is the Collegiate Assessment of Academic Proficiency Critical Thinking Test, one of the 3 standardized tests in the U.S. that was being used in some of our voluntary systems of accountability, along with MAP and CLA. We had questionnaires on academic motivation. We had questions on students' interest in different career paths, their degree, how far they wanted to go in their academic career in terms of what degrees they wanted. We actually had a test of moral reasoning, which we could talk about a little bit, about how students reason through difficult moral dilemmas. We had all sorts of questions on students' interest in engagement and diversity, interest in reading and writing, well-being, a real gamut of things that, as Kathy said, we're trying to get the broad spectrum of liberal arts education, of the broad set of skills that students would need throughout their lives to work well in both the job they got after graduation and down the road, but also grades, credits, other information as well.
So at the end of all of this, after testing all of these students, asking all these questions about what they experienced in and out of the classroom, what did we learn? And we should say that we didn't start out by saying, well, we think these things are important. We asked questions about just about anything we could think of and let the data tell us what was correlated with growth on that broad range of outcomes that Charlie just talked about. And should mention, again, we were looking for things that help students grow in all of those areas, not something that would help students develop critical thinking, but not moral reasoning and not an interest in diversity. And we were looking for things that help students at all of the institutions in the study. And we found some things. We found some good practices. Now, and they're up here. There are 3 broad areas. And as you look at these, I don't think you'll be surprised by them, because there's a wealth of research in higher education that says that these are good things for students and that these support learning. But let me run through them, since we spent a lot of time and energy to find this. So the first group of experiences, we call it good teaching and high quality interactions with faculty and staff. That means that students have caring adults on campus, whether they be faculty or staff, people who are interested in their development as individuals, not just in the grades they get in a class, but are interested in who they are, what they want to do with their lives, and how they're doing in the class and what they're learning. That students interact with faculty and staff outside of the classrooms or programs or whatever formal structures are set up for their interaction. That students experience classes that are organized, where their instructors are prepared, where they feel like things are clear, where they get prompt feedback on the work that they're doing. And these are shocking things, aren't they? The second thing is academic challenge and high expectations. Again, these are terms we've coined to describe all the questions that group together here. But academic challenge involves two areas. The first one is a basic sort of hard work. So how much work are students doing? How much time are they spending preparing for class? How much reading are they doing? How much writing are they doing? Basic workload, which is something I think faculty are always disappointed by once they find out how much time their students are spending. And then the second part is the level of intellectual work that students are doing. So are they simply memorizing and spitting back facts, or are they analyzing, synthesizing, integrating information, making judgments about what they're learning? And then the last area, we call it interactional diversity, and that's the extent to which students have meaningful interactions with people who are different from them and with ideas that are different from the ones that they hold. And we say meaningful interactions, so it's not just saying hello to someone who looks different from you as you walk across campus, but it's talking about things you've learned in class, values, the way you view the world, potentially challenging discussions, but those are the discussions that really matter. Mm-hmm.
And the thing that's really interesting about these is that you saw that we have this broad range of outcome measures. What's fascinating about these kind of basic good practices is that students who report higher levels of these things tend to be doing well on all of the outcomes we're measuring, from the critical thinking and moral reasoning to the other attitudes and diversity, to their interest in reading and writing, to their motivation and doing well in college. That these basic good practices, when students experience them, have broad effects across all of the things that we were measuring. The second thing, both on these and the outcomes, is what you will see at the institution level, an extraordinary amount of variability within institutions. So even though in the U.S. Kathy saw ranking systems of schools that are ranked as being very prestigious and not so prestigious, frankly, the average differences both in the outcome growth and in the overall level of these things are relatively small between institutions. What was enormous was the range, the variability within each institution for how much students grew or what the kind of good practices they experienced. Okay, so colleges and universities got all this wonderful data back. We created these huge reports and sent them back. And what happened? Well, the answer is, frankly, is not a hell of a lot. Not a hell of a lot. I'll focus here in the 2006 cohort. We had 3 cohorts of schools that went through the Wabash study, one in 2006, one in 2007, and one in 2008. And in 2006, our theory was get really high quality data back, get great analyses back, get elaborate reports back to institutions that had all sorts of information. And after 4 years, half the schools, only a little over half the schools, had actually disseminated the information on campus. Okay, 37% of the schools, there was actually no response at all we could detect to the data whatsoever. And in fact, at one point we started sending out reports using the Google Docs so we could track when they were being downloaded. A lot of schools, they weren't even being downloaded. It's really interesting. Some attended a workshop, and as far as we could tell, about a quarter of them actually had some response to the data. Now, after the 2006, we could see this happening, so we really started gearing up activities. We started creating workshops at the centers. We started doing site visits and so on. And in the 2008 cohort, you do see an effect in the sense that after 2 years, the 2008 cohort, there's as much activity, responsiveness, as there was after 4 years in the first cohort that went through. And my point of these slides is that you can do all sorts of stuff for accountability and so on, but institutions have actually a really hard time, at least in our experience, using the data effectively. And they need lots of support, they need help. They're not really built to make sense of and use evidence on student learning outside the classroom level.
We wanted to finish up by just talking about a couple of the lessons we've learned in our work over the past 10, 11 years. Again, starting with the model of change that was collect really high quality data, give it to institutions, and magic will happen, to what Charlie just showed you with magic not happening. So some of the things that we've learned about student learning in higher education. As the first bullet says there, we've seen that students can report useful information about their learning environment. And we mentioned that because one of the common responses when we talk about the data, and especially those good practices I walked through before, a lot of people will say, well, but that's just students' perception. And as the data in this study showed, students, yes, it is students' perception, and we're not saying that their reports of how much time they spend are precise, but we think they can be used as an indication of more or less in terms of, spending more or less time reading or doing more or less writing. But when students report higher levels of those good practices, they do better on separate outcome measures. So in a sense, our study's shown that these broad engagement measures, if you will, can predict growth on broad outcomes. So it doesn't matter if I think I'm teaching my class in a clear and organized way. It doesn't matter if Charlie comes into my class and thinks I'm teaching in a clear and organized way. Because if my students sit there and say, I don't know what you're doing, that's what matters. The second thing that we've seen from the data in the study is that students really cannot accurately report how much they learn. And I would say this isn't just students, this is something that people in general have trouble doing. So in the Wabash study, we had outcome measures for critical thinking, all those things Charlie just went through. And then we also had some questions from the National Survey of Student Engagement that asked students to say how much they thought they had learned in critical thinking or how much their attitudes in diversity had changed over 4 years of college. So we could look at students' self-report versus their change on a critical thinking test or surveys about their attitudes on diversity. And there was absolutely no correlation between what students thought had happened and what had actually happened. So it's very interesting, but if you think about it, it's a hard thing to do. So if I'm sitting there, I have to think back 4 years, what was I doing 4 years ago? I have to have an accurate conception of what I was doing, then accurately be able to figure out what I'm doing now. It's a very hard thing for people to do. Another thing that we've seen as we've traveled around, and Charlie mentioned this, the enormous variability in terms of teaching quality course content. So if you look at student reports on any institution in the study, there are students who say they are having a fabulous, wonderful experience. Great faculty, they're being challenged, they're thinking about things. And then students at that same institution will say, I'm not having a great experience. And this happens at every single institution. And part of that is the variation in course content that we've seen. So we've seen sections of the same course that should presumably be promoting the same outcomes, but they're taught by different people who never talk to each other, who don't coordinate work together in any way, shape, or form. So you can't really have a coherent sort of structure there. Which gets to the next point, that most U.S. institutions are really not structured to create coherent, developmentally sequenced learning environments for their students, especially not in the broad general education courses. Some of the majors are certainly more structured, but when it comes to those broad sort of outcomes, it usually students need to take a certain number of courses from a much broader array of courses at some point in time in their college career, and that varies widely. And then the last thing we've learned is that accountability and improvement really don't mix well. And we certainly think that institutions have a responsibility to be able to say what they're doing, to be able to demonstrate that they are doing what they say they're doing for their students. But accountability is all about proving to other people that you're doing a good job, highlighting your strengths. What we try to help institutions do is improve, is to get better for their students. And in order to do that, you have to be willing to take a close look at what you're doing, identify where you could do better, and then try things. And often when you try something to make it better, it doesn't go well, it fails. You might get horrible course evaluations. And so you need to tinker and play, and that space to do that is very hard if you're trying to prove to other people that you're doing a good job.
Okay, let me finish up here and then have some time for questions. So I think the lessons we've learned about doing this project, if we start again from scratch, the idea of doing really high quality data, longitudinal data, mixed methods. I said we do a lot of interviews with students, and the student interviews, we've actually worked with schools that have students do student interviews on the data to make sense of how the data, what the survey data mean in the particular context of your institution is really good. But we also say not research quality in some ways. One of the things, for example, if you're doing interviews or qualitative data, there's no way you can spend the amount of time that a good researcher with qualitative methods would use to gather, to create the interviews, to transcribe them and theme them out at a pace that's fast enough for schools to use on an annual basis. One of the things I'd say that, at least in U.S. institutions, that the fact is that most college professors in the U.S. have never had any formal training on how to teach, and that assessment data, for it to have any impact, has to work at the classroom level for faculty. And I'd almost at this point start thinking, we work with institutions now, we stop talking about assessment, we really talk about faculty development, which is another way of saying faculty training, which you can't say in the US today because training sounds too low level. But how do you take the evidence and use it to figure out what to help faculty with to learn to do a better job in the classroom? How do you structure, how do you create those opportunities for faculty to learn from the data and support their efforts to try new experiments in the classroom, new things in the courses that will actually result in student learning improvements? Third is that just, for at least in the US, a lot of times people own courses and they don't talk to each other about what's going on in those courses. Departments don't really talk to each other that much. And to use assessment data effectively requires a level of conversation and transparency that a lot of places aren't used to. So literally having colleagues in departments sit down and talk carefully what's happening, going well in their classes, not going well, how they're handing students off from one course to the next, having people talk across departments when there are co-requisite requirements on how those things are working well. So a level of conversation, evidence sharing, at least in the US, that's not currently there. And it's a lot of extra work to start doing that all of a sudden, to start saying, okay, what's happening to the student as she goes from my classes, my major, to general education and to her senior level courses? How are we working together on these things? Lastly, a lot of faculty we work with don't like standardized tests. There's a movement in the US to start using student work and rubrics. You talked about portfolios. And it's a really interesting tension because they don't like the standardized tests. They don't feel they represent their work well, but they really don't have time to use to actually gather and do the kind of careful work with student portfolios and things that you need to do to create robust information from those. So it's a tension. And the last thing is this stuff takes time. I think for improving critical thinking on a large campus, you're talking about sometimes a 7, 8, 10-year horizon to do that work. Campuses are very big and complicated places, and getting that evidence to do good work and getting it infiltrating through the campus system and having people work on it and make changes that result in improvement takes a while. It's not an overnight kind of thing.